Right now, somewhere on Earth, the sun is setting on a species that used to be helpless after dark. For 99% of the time humans have existed, there were no streetlights, no flashlights, no glowing rectangle in your pocket. When the sun dropped below the horizon, the world didn't just get dim, it went black. Black enough that you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Black enough that the animals hunting you could see you perfectly, and you couldn't see them at all. And yet, we survived. Not for 100 years, not for 1,000, for roughly 300,000 years of nights in the open with no walls and no locks, surrounded by lions, hyenas, leopards, and wolves that were all better built for the dark than we were. So how did a slow, clawless, practically blind-at-night primate make it to sunrise, night after night, for 3,000 centuries? The answer isn't just fire. It's a survival system. 5 separate tricks stacked on top of each other. Some biological, some social, some so strange that scientists spent a century mistranslating them by accident. Let's take it apart, piece by piece. Start with the basic design flaw. Humans are what scientists call diurnal, built for daylight. Our eyes have a decent number of color-sensing cones, but relatively few of the light-gathering rod cells that let animals see in near darkness. We have no tapetum lucidum, that mirror-like layer behind the eyes of cats and dogs that bounces light back through the retina for a second pass. We can't hear ultrasonic rustling like an owl. We can't smell a predator downwind like a deer can. Now, compare that to the animals sharing the landscape with early humans. Leopards, lions, hyenas, and wolves, all nocturnal or semi-nocturnal hunters, all with night vision roughly 6 to 8 times better than ours. For most of human evolution, sundown didn't mean time for bed. It meant the balance of power flips, and you become the slow, half-blind animal on someone else's menu. Every early hominin that ever climbed a tree at dusk and stayed dead silent until dawn was making a rational calculation. Movement at night equals death. And for a long time, that was simply the rule, until one invention broke it completely. The earliest solid evidence of humans deliberately controlling fire comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, dated to roughly 1 million years ago. Burned bone fragments in ash layers deep inside a cave, far from any natural wildfire. Long before Homo sapiens existed, an earlier human relative had already discovered the one tool that could rewrite the rules of the dark. Fire didn't just produce warmth, it produced territory. Research on modern hunter-gatherer groups has repeatedly shown the same pattern. A campfire creates a rough perimeter, often sighted around 30 feet across, that most predators simply will not cross. Inside that ring of light, relative safety. Outside it, the old rules still apply, and people who wander past the firelight at night are measurably more likely to be attacked. But here's the part that's easy to miss. Fire didn't just protect people, it gave them time. Before fire, the usable day ended the moment the sun did. As little as 8 hours of activity in winter, maybe 12 in summer. Once a group could keep flames alive after dark, they suddenly had 2 to 4 extra hours of waking life every single day for the rest of history. Multiply that across thousands of generations, and you're not just talking about staying warm. You're talking about the raw material that built human culture, because those extra hours had to be filled with something. And it turns out, what filled them changed. Fire solved the predator problem when everyone was awake and gathered close. But what about the hours when the whole group needed to sleep at once? A sleeping camp is a vulnerable camp, unless someone, somewhere, is always awake. In 2017, researchers led by anthropologist David Sampson studied the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania, and found something remarkable. Humans don't all get sleepy and wake up at the same time. People have naturally different chronotypes. Some are wired to feel alert late at night. Others wake naturally before dawn, and this tendency gets more pronounced with age. Older adults in the group tended to fall asleep earlier and wake earlier. Younger adults stayed up later and slept in later. The researchers tracked sleep across the entire camp for 20 nights and found something that looked almost engineered. Across those 20 nights, there was only 18 total minutes where every single person in the camp was asleep at the same time. In other words, across roughly 200 hours of nighttime, the camp was almost never fully unguarded. Someone was always, statistically, awake. This wasn't a night watch schedule anyone assigned. Nobody was standing guard on purpose. It was built into human biology itself, a side effect of age-related sleep variation that, purely by accident, produced a rolling security system. Scientists call it the Sentinel hypothesis. Mixed age groups sleep in a staggered pattern that keeps the camp guarded without anyone sacrificing their own rest for it. It's a strange thought that the reason your grandparents wake up at 5 a.m. and you can't fall asleep before midnight might be a genetic echo of a system built to keep a fire-lit camp safe for 300,000 years. Here's where the story gets stranger, because it turns out ancient humans weren't just staggering who slept when. They were sleeping in a completely different pattern than almost anyone alive today. In 2001, historian Roger E. Kirch published the result of 16 years spent combing through historical documents, prayer books from the 1400s, court records, diaries, medical texts, even passages in Homer. Over and over, in more than 500 separate sources, he found references to something called first sleep and second sleep. The pattern was consistent. People went to bed shortly after dark, slept for about 4 hours, then woke up. Not from a disturbance, not from insomnia, but as a completely normal part of the night. They'd stay awake for an hour or two in the middle of the night, then fall back asleep for another 4 hours until dawn. For centuries, translators reading these old texts had assumed first sleep was some kind of typo or metaphor, because it was almost unthinkable to them that people once slept differently than we do now. The assumption ran so deep that ancient Greek and medieval Latin texts were literally mistranslated to erase this pattern from the historical record. Then, in 1992, psychiatrist Thomas Ware at the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health decided to test it directly. He took a group of volunteers and removed every source of artificial light from their lives for a month, giving them roughly 14 hours of darkness a night, close to what our ancestors would have experienced before fire extended the evening. Within weeks, without being told to do anything, every participant fell into the exact same rhythm Kirch had found in the old texts. 4 hours of sleep, 1 to 3 hours of calm wakefulness, then 4 more hours of sleep. And the middle window wasn't just awake. Ware measured hormone levels and found participants were producing elevated prolactin, the same hormone released during meditation and after orgasm. They described the state as peaceful, reflective, almost meditative. It wasn't insomnia. It was a completely distinct state of consciousness that the modern world has almost entirely erased. So what did ancient people actually do during that gap? Historical records say pretty much everything. They visited neighbors, wrote, prayed, interpreted the dreams from their first sleep while they were still fresh. One 16th century French physician even recommended it as the best time for couples to conceive children, believing they'd do it better in that unhurried, half-lit hour. A doctor's manual from the 1500s called it simply the watch, the quiet stretch when the mind was calm and the world was still. Modern hunter-gatherer studies back this up from a different angle. When researchers tracked sleep in Hadza and other traditional societies using actual sleep monitors, they found average nightly sleep of only around 6¼ hours, less than the recommended 8, and that people didn't fall asleep the moment it got dark. On average, they stayed up roughly 3 hours after sunset, preparing food, making tools, talking, before finally settling in. The night wasn't wasted, it was used. So what filled all those extra hours fire had unlocked? The hours before first sleep, and the quiet ones in between. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Wiesner published a study that may be one of the most important pieces of evidence we have for how human culture actually began. She spent years recording real conversations among the Juhansi Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, one of the last groups on Earth still living something close to the ancestral human lifestyle. During the day, she found, about 80% of conversation was purely practical. Who's hunting where? Which plants are ripe? Complaints, logistics, negotiation. Daytime talk was work. But at night, around the fire, the entire character of conversation flipped. At night, 81% of conversations turned into stories, tales of distant people, adventures, myths explaining the origin of the world, jokes that had the whole camp laughing. Firelight didn't just keep predators away. It created the one setting in the entire ancestral world where a group of tired, well-fed people sat still, faced each other, and had nothing to do but talk. Wiesner's argument is that this is where human culture was actually born, the campfire functioning as the original theater, the original classroom, the original church. It's where humans first learned to think beyond the immediate moment, to imagine, to plan, to pass down values and warnings and history to children who hadn't lived through it themselves. Every myth, every origin story, every piece of oral history that survived long enough to be written down almost certainly started as firelight conversation, repeated night after night for tens of thousands of years until it became permanent. Fire wasn't the only light source ancient humans learned to read. The moon mattered too, and modern research on the Hadza has actually measured exactly how much. A study tracking Hadza activity against the lunar cycle found a real, measurable link between moon phase and behavior. But the direction was the opposite of what researchers initially expected. As moonlight increased, nighttime activity actually went down, not up. People shifted more of their activity into daylight hours, rather than using the brighter nights to stay up later. Separately, other research on the same population found that on darker, less moonlit nights, people slept less and moved around more after dark, likely because a moonless night made staying alert rather than sleeping deeply the safer bet. Either way, the moon functioned as a kind of dial for ancient humans. Full moons meant enough natural light to travel, to keep a fire tended more easily, to feel some visibility if a predator approached. New moons meant true blackout conditions, the most dangerous nights of the month, and very likely the nights groups clustered closest to the fire and stayed most alert. Many traditional cultures built entire calendars, rituals, and even hunting taboos around the lunar cycle, and this research suggests that wasn't superstition dressed up as science. It was a genuinely accurate read on which nights were more dangerous. Fire and staggered sleep solved the open ground problem, but wherever possible, ancient humans stacked a third layer on top: geography. Caves, rock overhangs, and dense thickets reduced the number of directions an attack could come from to 1 or 2, instead of all 360 degrees. Fire at a cave mouth did double duty, blocking the one approach a predator had, while trapping warmth inside. And where there was no cave, there was the oldest defense of all: the group itself. A lone human at night was extraordinarily vulnerable. A cluster of 10, 20, or 30 sleeping close together, ringed by firelight, with a staggered watch built into their very biology, was a far harder target. Predators, like most hunters, favored the isolated and the easy. Numbers, positioning, and fire together turned humans from the most vulnerable creature on the savannah after dark into a group predators typically chose to avoid. Not every survival tool was physical. Some were psychological, and they were just as effective. Across nearly every traditional culture on record, the night carried its own set of rules. Don't wander past the firelight. Don't whistle after dark. Don't say certain names once the sun sets. Beware of spirits said to walk after dusk. It's tempting to write these off as pure superstition, but functionally, they did exactly what a modern safety regulation does. Fear of evil spirits in the dark forest produced the exact same behavior as a rational risk assessment. Stay close to the fire. Stay with the group. Don't go wandering alone into leopard territory at 2 a.m. The belief system and the survival strategy were, in practice, the same instruction wearing different clothes. And it likely worked precisely because fear is a far more reliable motivator in a child or a tired adult than a lecture about predator statistics. For 300,000 years, this was the system. Fire for territory, staggered biology for security, two-phase sleep for rest and reflection, firelight conversation for culture, moonlight for timing, shelter and numbers for defense, and shared fear to keep everyone close. It worked. It's the reason you exist. Then, starting in the 1600s, cities began installing street lamps, Paris under Louis XIV, London soon after, explicitly to push back the darkness and the crime that thrived in it. Cheaper candles followed, then gaslighting in the 1800s, then in 1879, the commercial electric light bulb. Within a single generation, the night that had shaped humans for 3,000 centuries was functionally switched off. Even the word we use for a government-mandated bedtime, curfew, comes from the Old French couvre-feu, literally cover fire. In medieval towns, a bell rang each evening ordering everyone to smother their household flames, not for safety, but because night was supposed to be dark, and being caught outside without a lantern was, in many towns, simply illegal. We didn't just add light to the night, we deleted the state of mind that used to live inside it. Modern humans are now exposed to artificial light for an average of 7 to 8 hours after sunset, and the blue heavy light from screens suppresses melatonin so effectively that your brain can't reliably tell the difference between a lamp and the sun. Researchers have found that people who spend just 1 week camping with zero artificial light have their melatonin cycles reset by nearly 2 hours, the ancient rhythm reasserting itself in days, like it had simply been waiting. So the next time you wake at 2 in the morning and lie there in the dark for no obvious reason, it might be worth asking a different question than, "What's wrong with me?" For 300,000 years, that quiet hour between first sleep and second sleep wasn't a malfunction. It was where people thought, connected, and simply existed without demands. We spent 3,000 centuries learning exactly how to survive the dark, with fire, with each other, with a body that quietly staggers its own rest to keep watch even when we don't ask it to. And then, in the space of about 100 years, we made the dark disappear. We call that progress. Maybe it partly is. But somewhere in all that light, we lost a version of the night and a version of ourselves that our ancestors would have found completely unrecognizable.